Tonight, pressure on the Prime Minister as the Mandelson fallout threatens to engulf his leadership. Sir Keir Starmer says he would not have appointed Lord Mandelson as ambassador to the United States if he knew what he knows now, as the opposition secure an emergency debate for tomorrow morning. Support, though, from one of his Labour predecessors, as Gordon Brown tells me he believes the Prime Minister will be completely exonerated in any investigation. We'll play you my full interview and we'll hear why he's calling on the government to act to tackle child poverty. Are Labour rebels eyeing up the Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham as a potential challenger to the Prime Minister? Labour MPs have met tonight. We'll bring you the latest. The party is over. The message to the Conservatives from a shadow minister, Danny Kruger, as he defects to Reform UK. And as the United Kingdom prepares to roll out the red carpet for Donald Trump tomorrow, we look at the risks and potential rewards for the Prime Minister from the state visits. There's always a red carpet rollout for our panel tonight. Andrew Fisher and Simon Clark, they'll be with us for the next hour. It's Monday. I'm Darren McCaffrey, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. A very good evening and welcome. I want to start tonight by talking about the importance of momentum. No, not the Corbyn supporting movement, but just how much momentum matters in politics and how today we've witnessed this somewhat intangible force with some clarity. Because on the one side, you've got the government, the Prime Minister. And momentum there, frankly, is going one way, a sense that it simply cannot get anything right. The Mandelson issue rumbles on, another resignation and much talk of leadership challenge. Now, on that, personally, a month ago, even a few weeks ago, the thought that Starmer would not last to the next election seemed pretty unlikely to me. But there are three key tests coming up for the Prime Minister, I would say. Party conference season, a budget, and next year's elections. If one or all of them go wrong, maybe it really will be squeaky bum time. Maybe the momentum will get too much. And then you contrast that with Reform and Nigel Farage. Another Conservative defection today, riding high in the polls, somewhat setting the policy agenda. It might actually get to the point where the party starts refusing to accept any more Tories. But this is momentum. And in politics, momentum breeds momentum. It snowballs. People want to back winners. Well, at the moment, one person who's definitely not a winner is the Prime Minister, who's had another pretty miserable Monday, as our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, reports.
Meeting businesses and trying to focus on the Trump state visit.
Nice to see you. How are you? It's a good day, isn't it?
But as he was speaking, yet another surprise resignation from number 10. Paul Ovenden, in Keir Starmer's most inner circle, out over crude messages about Diane Abbott, written 8 years ago, but still damaging for number 10 today. But last week's departure also looms large. The Prime Minister claimed he could not have seen this coming when he was appointed.
I knew of his association with Epstein, but had I known then what I know now, I'd have never appointed him. Because what emerged last week were emails, Bloomberg emails, which showed that the nature and extent of the relationship that Peter Mandelson had with Epstein was far different to what I had understood to be the position when I appointed him.
Every week, this number 10 tries to reset the narrative. Every week, it fails. There was some support from a predecessor who endured his own troubled premiership.
Every government goes through difficulties. Probably 15 years ago when I was in government, you'd be asking me questions about what had happened on a particular day. But this is not really, in the end, about personalities.
It's also about judgment, though, isn't it?
I don't want to criticise Keir Starmer's judgment because he faces very difficult decisions, and we're talking about a very narrow area for timing between a Tuesday and a Thursday. I think once the record is out, Keir Starmer will be completely exonerated.
The Tories want to force the pace in Parliament.
Why was it ever thought acceptable to appoint a man with such a checkered and murky background to such a vitally important position? And it's not just a question of the Prime Minister's political judgment, important as that is. It's a question of ethics. It's a question of what is deemed acceptable behaviour when in positions of power. And, Mr. Speaker, the House must have the opportunity to debate this matter before the recess.
The Speaker gave this promise.
The debate will be held tomorrow, Tuesday, the 16th of September, as the first item of public business.
The Tories lost a big beast as well today.
A Member of Parliament for East Wiltshire. His name is Danny Kruger.
A big defection to Reform UK.
The Conservative Party is over. Over as a national party. Over as the principal opposition to the left. To be Conservative is not to worship the ashes of defunct institutions. It is to preserve the fire that gives our country its life. The new custodian of that fire, the best hope we have, maybe our last hope, and I fervently hope the next Prime Minister, is Nigel Farage.
The current PM needs this week to go well for him, but so far it's more of the same. Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, you saw Gordon Brown in Sam's report there, and you can hear my full interview with him a little later on in the programme, but delighted to say Sam Coates is with me in the studio. Sam, very good evening to you. You know lots of people inside Number 10. What's the mood tonight like there?
I mean, it's quite grim. It has been for some time. There is a sort of pressing on vibe at the moment there. But I watched that interview really closely. And I don't know about you, but I thought he looked cross. I thought Keir Starmer looked more kind of red-faced and he was more tetchy than I can remember him. He is starting to fight for his political life at the moment, I have to say, because things are going wrong. I mean, as you heard me say in the report, every week they try and reset the story, and every week they're failing at the moment.
Because today we had another resignation.
Today we did. Paul Ovenden, and it's hard to overstate how close that guy is, or was until this afternoon, to Keir Starmer. The news of that resignation was hitting just before that interview, and Keir Starmer is losing the sounding boards around him that he's depended on all the way back through to that period in opposition, and that's why it's quite grim. But let's just focus on the substance for a moment, because in the end, what you saw Keir Starmer do was say, look, I couldn't have possibly known what was going to happen with Peter Mandelson until I saw all those emails on Wednesday night of last week. But the truth is that so much of what Peter Mandelson was up to was in the public domain. There were court documents that were unsealed in 2019 revealing that Peter Mandelson had an active relationship, business deals, helping with political support, staying in the house of Jeffrey Epstein, post-conviction, post this guy pleading guilty for sex trafficking with a minor. And it was after that Peter Mandelson engaged with him at length. Peter Mandelson says it's an albatross around his neck and he regrets it. Downing Street say, even though stuff was in the public domain since 2019, they couldn't possibly have known the full extent of it until the Bloomberg emails come along.
Which is extraordinary itself, because you think, first of all, it's Peter Mandelson, who, you know, has had a colourful past and caused trouble in governments in the past. And second of all, given the nature of this, you would have thought the Prime Minister say, I want to know as much as possible. I want to know everything as soon as possible.
I just wonder whether or not there isn't a bigger picture here, which is a continual incuriosity from our Prime Minister. And I think you can point that to so many things, whether it was the manifesto and whether things would work, whether it was his tax policy, whether it was the playing out how the winter fuel changes would play, the cabinet changes that he made. I just think too often there are things that other people can see coming that this Prime Minister does not. And I wonder whether the last couple of weeks are some good examples of that.
OK, Sam, for the moment, thank you. You're going to stay here, though, because we're going to bring in our panel, the former Director of Policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, obviously Andrew Fisher, and the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Sir Simon Clarke. Gentlemen, very good evening to you both.
Hello.
Andrew, what's your take on all of this?
It's disastrous for Keir Starmer, and it's disastrous for morale within the Labour Party and especially within the Parliamentary Labour Party, because there have been a range of self-inflicted mistakes almost from the day he got into 10 Downing Street. The winter fuel payments, the cuts to disability benefits, which I've had to row back on, where, you know, there was this huge rebellion of normally quite obedient MPs, frankly, rebelled and said, no, look, we're not doing this. There's huge kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A kind of unease with the line they've been taking on migration and asylum, that they haven't stood up to reform. They've kind of pandered to it. And that seems to have, if you look at the polls, not won over any reform voters and alienated a lot of Labour's base who would want
Storm?
this.
I mean, people in government, people outside of government would accept he was dealt a pretty tough hand.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
It wasn't the easiest transition into government, but that's not enough. You think it's him personally?
Look, I think there was a dishonesty at the heart of the Labour's last manifesto, which I think Sam referred to there. The policies weren't enough to deal with the times he was inheriting. There was this, tiny tweaks to tax around, private schools and a few other things that just didn't raise enough revenue to transform public services, to get people out of the cost of living crisis. And now there is this public frustration that things haven't got better. There is still a cost of living crisis. These things haven't been addressed. And on top of it, there have been these kind of self-inflicted misjudgments over Mandelson, on policy and personnel that I think, it's really undermining people's belief in him. And that goes right deep into the middle of the Labour Party as well. I'm not just talking about people on the left, but actually a lot of MPs who you would have thought would be quite loyal to Keir Starmer, natural allies of him, are now saying, I don't think he's going to last much longer.
Simon?
Well, it's a shambles. I mean, Sam, I think, puts his finger on it, and he didn't.
And
he didn't
no
say
offence,
it.
but you've seen some shambles in the past.
Ultimately, I know a crisis when I see one. This is a bona fide crisis, and it's a crisis of politics, right, as well as of substance. I think what Sam was saying is true, that, the shorthand version is, and Sam's too polite to say so, Keir Starmer is a tin-eared politician, and he keeps making avoidable mistakes. And, that's where this morphs over into the more serious thing, which is we aren't being told the truth. Somewhere in this whole fiasco lies responsibility for a major mistake. And it's either in the vetting, which wasn't sufficiently thorough to explore the full extent of Mandelstein's links to Epstein, or it's in what the Prime Minister was then told about the vetting, i.e. what his aides briefed him, or it's in what the Prime Minister chose to do with the vetting if it was indeed complete. But someone somewhere has dropped the ball big time. And I think tomorrow, in the debate that's being called in Parliament, it's going to be very difficult for Labour to whip their MPs to vote against the release of the document.
Just on this point, where does it go to next, Sam, do you reckon?
I mean, there'll be a debate in Parliament. That will be embarrassing, but MPs go away for almost a month after tomorrow, so I can't see a parliamentary process being the big thing. The big thing here, I don't think it is all about the vetting. I think that Peter Kyle told us what was going on, which is that this government took a calculated risk. They knew there was some stuff that they didn't really want to look at too hard involving Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, and nevertheless decided he was the right answer to the question of who should be our man in Washington. And they took that risk, and they probably just didn't look hard enough at what was staring them in the face. They took a risk and it blew up in their face. The question is that a habitual problem that MPs are going to come unstuck with again and again and again, in which case this government really is in the worst kind of trouble? Or can they convince their troops that this is fixable and it won't happen again?
And Andrew, that's the point. I don't know if you saw my thing at the top of the programme talking about momentum, how it matters in politics. Sometimes momentum can almost overtake, and there is this sense that at the moment the government just cannot get anything right, and that can't carry on for that long, can it?
No, I don't think it can. And I think in some ways the only thing keeping Keir Starmer in place, really, in the medium term is the fact there isn't an obvious replacement sitting in Parliament. Now, there are MPs who are clearly hoping that Andy Burnham gets back into Parliament, and then they do see the back of Keir Starmer and replace him with Andy Burnham. But currently he's the Mayor of Greater Manchester and not an MP. So there is that tension going on, certainly. And obviously the revelations today about Paul Ovenden, which again just plays into this thing of people's factional faults being overlooked because they're in the right faction of the Labour Party. And I think we've seen this with the Conservative Party. You have Boris Johnson narrow down the Conservative Party. People like David Gauke and Kenneth Clarke kicked out in a very narrow faction.
And actually, as well,
we've seen the same thing now with Labour, and it doesn't bode well. You've got to have people disagree with you in politics.
It's funny how when problems come, they come in legions, don't they, right?
They're like buses.
Exactly. And I do think that this fresh Ovenden issue today the government cannot get ahead of the situation, and I fear tomorrow will be very messy for them. And fundamentally, it is, I'm afraid, because I think Sam's right? They didn't want to see what was in front of them, and that has very serious consequences, not just for their credibility, but for their moral standing, I think.
Gentlemen, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates, always a pleasure. Thank you. Let's stick with Labour and one man who's worked pretty closely, not necessarily, I'd say, always been friends with Lord Mandelson, is, of course, the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. He brought him back into government, remember, in 2008. The government of all the talents, it was branded as business secretary, and handed him a peerage, despite, of course, that close relationship he had with his rival, Tony Blair. Well, I sat down with the former Prime Minister and we discussed whether Lord Mandelson has a future, but we began by talking about his passion, the ongoing campaign on child poverty. Mr. Brown, thank you very much indeed. I suppose my first question is that child poverty is an issue that's never really gone away, but what's your sense of how bad it is in 2025 Britain?
Child poverty is the biggest cause of social division in our country. I don't think many people realise just how poor the situation of so many children are. There's 1 million children who are near destitution, and that means they're without some of the basic essentials, whether it be housing, a shelter, or whether it be food, or whether it be, for example, basic hygiene essentials. And then there's 2 million children living in homes that either don't have a cooker or a fridge or a washing machine, and are certainly without some of the basic sort of toiletries like soap and shampoo. There are 3 million children who are having to skip meals because there's not enough food in the house. And then officially there are 4.5 million children under the government's own definition of poverty, in poverty. And that's the biggest figure in the last 60 years when figures started being collected. Now, it's the result of, if you like, the social security changes made under the Conservatives. So they are essentially austerity's children. But now is the time, with the budget coming up, to think of what we can do. There's a child poverty review that the government is asking for consultation on, and that's where I'm giving my views.
Yeah, and also this big give. Talk to us what that's all about.
Well, the crisis support system in Britain has really suffered. And if something goes wrong in the family, if there's an illness, if there's cancer, for example, if there's a death, or if there's a redundancy, where do people turn? Because the normal social security system is not really providing for them. And that's where charities come in, and it's where corporate giving comes in, and it's where food banks, of course, 2,600 in this country. Fair Share is another food organisation. And what we do is, we're like a food bank, but we provide bedding, we provide toiletries, we provide furnishings, we provide baby goods, we provide clothes. And so we take a holistic view of the needs of a child. And at the same time, we want not just to provide a safety net, we want to provide a springboard so that children and the family can move out of poverty. So that's what the big give is, to raise money for the goods that we provide.
I think it's fair to say that you're essentially now campaigning on this issue of the 2-child benefit cap, aren't you? But at the end, the argument against it is we can't really afford it. I mean, it was imposed when public finances were not in a great state. They've got somewhat worse since. Can we really afford it?
Well, I understand the difficulties the government faces. I mean, the fiscal position in every European country is difficult, partly because defence spending is having to rise as a result of the Russian threat, partly because of the ageing population, a whole series of reasons. The energy transition is another costly business. But I've suggested during the course of the summer that if you look at a number of areas where money is available, then you can provide the funds to tackle child poverty. Now, if we tax the gambling industry fairly, the gambling industry, let's say the tax on online gambling in Delaware in America is 57%. It's 21% in Britain. Machine gaming is taxed around 25% in Britain, higher in other countries. If we tax the gambling industry fairly, they're mostly offshore companies. They don't pay VAT. They don't normally pay corporation tax if they're not based in Britain, of course. Then we could raise money. If, of course, the banks, which deposit money at the Bank of England, were paid less than the 4% interest rate they're getting, which is perfectly reasonable. We never used to pay interest rates at all, then we could raise some money. So I'm not suggesting find the money from breaking your election promises. I'm not suggesting find the money by breaking your fiscal rules. I'm saying here are sources of money, and if you've got to choose between fair taxation on the gambling industry and not helping children, let's help the children who are in desperate need, and we can do it immediately. And the problem is the figures will continue to rise as a result of the 2-child rule if we do nothing, because every year another another 50,000 children join the ranks of being poor the minute they're born.
And is this going to be a factor potentially in who you might support in the Labour deputy leadership race?
I'm not getting into leadership or deputy leadership elections. That's for the Labour Party MPs and then for the membership. But it's clear
the party is divided on this issue, or at least
but the important
at odds with the leadership.
The important thing is the policy. And I think most sensible people, when they look at the policy, they say, what is the most cost-effective way of taking 500,000 children out of poverty? What is the, if you like, the cheapest way of getting that number down? And that's the number we have to get down to go back to the situation we were a year or two ago. And the most cost-effective way is abolishing the two-child rule, and that's less than £3 billion. Now, that can be done, and I would have thought both deputy leadership candidates actually would want to support that.
What about the Prime Minister or the Chancellor? Have you talk to them in private about this? I mean, you clearly feel very passionate about it. It's something no one could ever accuse you of coming lately to. I mean, you've cared about this issue for a long time. I mean, have you spoken to Keir Starmer already?
Yeah, I've spoken to Keir Starmer, and Keir is very sympathetic. But, I mean, nobody wants to see, nobody I know in the country, whether conservative, reform or liberal or nationalist, would like to see child poverty rising. So I've talked to him and I've talked to other people. I'm happy to talk to any party about this. And certainly the charity that I work with, Multibank, is happy to talk to everybody about what could be done. And I think they're pretty sympathetic to what needs to be done. And the question is, do you take the opportunity of the coming budget, which is probably the last date on which you can be sure, if you took a decision, you could reduce child poverty next year and the year after? Do you take a decision in that budget? And I'm saying, look, here's the money. I've shown you where it can be done. I used to be a finance minister, a chancellor, so I know where you can find money. This is the money. This is what needs to be done. Let's take the first 500,000 children out of poverty, and we will actually relieve the poverty of 900,000 children by the measure I'm suggesting. And that's the start, because every child needs the best start in life.
Frustration that there's a Labour government in power and that you're having to make this case publicly.
Well, actually, there's a child poverty review, and I'm joining the consultation. So there's thousands of people have had the chance to join the consultation, and I think it's important that everybody puts their view. This is not a criticism of the government. The criticism is, if anything, of what hasn't been done in the last 10 years when things have got worse and worse and worse. So the consultation is the chance for me to put my view. And of course, the government's policy on this is not yet formed because they're listening to the consultation.
Can I just pick up on the term that you used? I thought it was really interesting to talk about it's the greatest cause of social division in this country. And I'm really keen to think what you thought of that march on Saturday, because there's a whole load of reasons why people came out, 150,000 of them, or maybe are supporting Nigel Farage, who want to see the cap removed. Is it, in essence, people's frustration with politics, with the government at the moment, because effectively living standards haven't really risen very much, and that there is such child poverty in this country?
Yeah, in every country in Europe, in fact, America and every country in Europe, there has been this rise of what you might call the populist nationalist right. So if you look at the opinion polls in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Netherlands, in Belgium, in Hungary, and in Britain and America, there's a populist nationalist upsurge.
Is poverty part of that?
And yes, I think people's frustration at the financial position that they're in has been a huge problem. And if you're concerned about standards of living, obviously you're concerned about everybody's standards of living, particularly those people who've fallen behind. And I think this is a feature of people's frustration right across Europe. But, what you've got to do in these situations is bring people together. We cannot have the politics of division. We cannot have people out there in the streets practicing the politics of divide and rule. The time when this happens and people feel frustrated is the time to bring people together and say, what do we have in common? What is it that defines Britain? And what defines Britain is a sense of fair play, and that everybody should have a decent chance in life and a sense of decency. And that's why I focus on child poverty, because if you want to look at the moral compass of our country, the moral compass of our country is that every child should have the best possible start in life. Every child has a potential, has a talent to fulfill. And if we could give every child the chance to fulfill their potential, then that's not just a moral issue of dignity for every child, it's an economic issue, because the benefit to the economy. We did a thing called Sure Start when we were in government, and the government now is trying to reintroduce it. And we found that the Sure Start expenditure on the early years of children, on their health and on their education, it yielded twice as much in benefit as we had spent in actually doing the programme. And it helped people get jobs, helped people stay out of hospital. It helped people stay out of juvenile
And
delinquency.
just on that, just finally on this thing about social division, and you know, you look at those images on Saturday, and you say that people need to remind of what unites them together. You're kind of uncomfortable seeing essentially the rise of the populist rights. What does it mean when you know, people clearly are very frustrated out there, aren't they?
Yeah, well, populist nationalism is basically saying it's us versus them. There are people that really don't form part of your society. You've either got to kick them out or you've got to do something to neutralise the voice. And we have got to preach the opposite message, that it's us and us, that we're all in this together. Yes, you've got to manage migration. Yes, you've got to come down heavily on crime and people who try to exploit crime. But at the same time, you've got to have a message, and I think this is what Keir Starmer is trying to do, is to bring people together and say we have got more in common than what divides us. But one of the things we have in common is a sense of social justice.
So just two final questions before I let you go. I must ask you about Lord Mandelson. You famously, obviously, brought him back into your government when you became Prime Minister, and you've known him for a very, very long time. Do you think Keir Starmer was right to appoint him as ambassador?
Well, look, the personal tragedy is actually of all the women that were molested and trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. And I think anybody who looks at the history of these years and what's happened has got to think first of the women who were affected, people who were juveniles, people who were not even of age for consent, were really traumatised by the experience they had at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. So my thinking about this is that we have got to just remember the victims. And if people have been callous about the victims, or if people have ignored the suffering of the victims in the interests of other things, then I think that's got to be pointed out. So I wouldn't want to talk about any individual here. I would want to talk about the suffering of the victims.
But I mean, it does, you know, it's a pretty difficult time for the Prime Minister. It does call somewhat into his judgment, doesn't it?
Look, every government goes through difficulties. Probably 15 years ago when I was in government, you'd be asking me questions about what had happened on a particular day. But this is not really, in the end, about personalities. In the end, it's about the policies. If you ask people in the street, they might say, well, interesting story, terrible thing that happened to these girls. But also they will say, look, what's happening to my life at the moment? What's happening to my community? What's happening to my industry? What's happening to the whole region? And I think we've got to think that politics is about changing people's lives and making a difference in those areas where they want to do things.
It's also about judgment, though, isn't it?
I don't want to criticise Keir Starmer's judgment, because he faces very difficult decisions, and we're talking about a very narrow area for timing between a Tuesday and a Thursday. I think once the record is out, Keir Starmer will be completely exonerated.
I was just wondering, you, as you rightly said, you know, being in Downing Street is not easy. What's your advice to Keir Starmer during what is, let's be honest about this, a pretty difficult time?
Well, I used to say to him, my advice is not to take my advice. But for Keir Starmer, look, he will be judged by the changes he makes in the Britain that he said needed reform and needed change. And I think you've got to give him the time to do that. I mean, most parliaments last 4 or 5 years. We're already just past the first year. And Keir Starmer deserves the opportunity. The British people voted for him to show what he can do. And I think his focus is on the economy, and his focus is on rebuilding civic society, and his focus is on keeping Britain safe and secure. And I think once you judge him on these things, you'll find that he's doing the things that are right for our country.
OK, Gordon Brown, thank you very much. OK, you're watching The Politics Hub here on Sky News. Coming up next, as Keir Starmer's backbenchers gather for that weekly Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, with his judgment very much under lots of scrutiny. Just how bad has it been for the Prime Minister? Liz Bates has had her ear to the door. We'll be speaking to her after the break.
Fire, shouts the commander. There's a dash to safety.
We've now got to wait inside the shelter to see if there is incoming.
I'm Deborah Hames, Sky's security and defence editor. Should Russia's war with Ukraine escalate significantly, pilots like these could be called upon to go into combat for real.
Welcome back. Now, in the last hour, the Parliamentary Labour Party has been meeting for its weekly session. The meeting, of course, runs off a pretty torrid few weeks for the Prime Minister, when many, including some within the party, have questioned his judgment and indeed his very leadership. Well, Liz Bates has been sampling the mood of the party. Doesn't look too good, Liz.
No, Darren, it doesn't look too good at all. It's not very scientific what we do here in the House of Commons when they have that weekly meeting of Labour MPs. We go and sit outside the room. We like to listen to see if there's a lot of applause, a lot of laughter. Does it sound like they're in a good mood? Now, first of all, I should say it was Yvette Cooper who has just been moved from Home Secretary to Foreign Secretary. She was there to address the MPs, as was the new Chief Whip, Johnny Reynolds. Now, they were both reasonably well received, but I have to say, the meeting itself was not well attended, and the mood here in Parliament is very, very divided. And there are MPs here that are openly talking about the fact that they think that Keir Starmer's days are numbered, and it is, I have to say, a little bit unusual to be in this position with a Prime Minister and a government that is only, just over a year into office. But they feel like, first of all, the issues are mounting, and in particular this issue with Peter Mandelson. They just want the government to, first of all, come clean and admit that they made a mistake in the first place. You know, this kind of rhetoric around inheriting a lot of problems. I think many of the Labour MPs feel like this was very much a self-inflicted problem. And then today, another story, Paul Ovenden, a very senior advisor who has been a long-standing advisor to the Prime Minister, now has had to step down because of these 8-year-old message exchanges that have been revealed. And so so Labour MPs not happy. One of them has just said to me, he's just not up to the job. It's terminal. Another MP said to me, this is end of days stuff. Another said he treats Labour MPs with contempt. And on this issue of potentially bringing back the welfare bill in a different form, they said if he thinks we're just going to roll over and vote for that bill next time round, he's got another thing coming. So real anger among some sections of Labour MPs. There are also, I have to say, some in the middle who aren't particularly happy with how the government are getting on, but they're not in full mutiny mode just yet, and they would really like to see this government get a grip and bring back a bit of stability. And I have to say, the issue of Lord Mandelson is ongoing because today the Speaker granted an emergency debate brought forward by David Davis. He's a veteran Conservative MP, and when he senses weakness in a government, he's been around long enough to know how to press that bruise to make the most of it from the opposition benches, and he has called for an emergency debate. The Speaker has granted it. There will be 3 hours of debate tomorrow in the House of Commons on Lord Mandelson, so this is not over for the government, and as I say, the mood here very divided, and the government just have a lot of work to do to get the party back on side.
OK, Liz, as always, thank you very much indeed. Liz Bates there in Central Lobby. Andrew and Simon are still with me. Andrew, what's interesting, because we've heard this actually quite a lot over the last year, even before all this trouble, is what Liz talked about there, the contempt that many Labour MPs feel that Keir Starmer has for them. That maybe with such a big majority, he felt he didn't really need to worry about his backbenchers. And maybe that's coming back to bite him now.
Yeah, I think it is. And as I said, we saw the same with Boris Johnson before, where he kind of purged one wing of the party, alienated them, didn't think much of them, and actually found, when it came to it, they weren't very loyal to him back. And I think this is happening to Keir Starmer. This has been a very, very narrow kind of faction of the Labour Party that is in control of the party now. It isn't pluralistic. I mean, if we think back to, before my time, but, the governments of Clement Attlee, but even the governments of Harold Wilson, they were broad. They had people from the left of the party, the right of the party, on the basis of merit, effectively, and there was encouraged to have debate within government. And we've seen, I think this is cross-party, so it's not a particularly Labour Party point, we've seen a diminution of that, and I think you get worse policy as a result. You need ideas to be challenged, and Keir Starmer He's quite a thin-skinned politician. He doesn't like to be challenged. He likes to think, I'm right, I know what I'm doing, and that's it, and you should all fall in line. And we've heard that from Bridget Phillipson, actually, in the last few days. She said, we just need to unite behind the leader. We need a united party. Well, unity goes two ways. You need to not suspend people for disagreeing with you. You need to not kick people out of the party for doing far less bad things than some of the people you've appointed to very senior positions.
Simon, we've seen pretty extraordinary politics over the last decade or so. I mean, no one's going to doubt that. But it still is, and we do need to step back a little bit and think, this man won a stonky majority only a year ago.
But it was a negative vote. Andrew and I were talking beforehand about mandate, and this government's mandate was never really established because they weren't particularly forthcoming / particularly honest about what it was that they wanted to do with power if they got it. The mandate really was, don't be the Conservatives, which worked as a general election tactic, but it's left them now with very little to cling to in terms of legitimacy when it comes to doing what they've done. And, clearly they've also done some things, in particular on tax, which they said they wouldn't do. And it feels to me like this is a government now where the odds are against Keir Starmer remaining as Labour leader through to the next election.
Which is, as I say, in historical standards, quite extraordinary.
Quite remarkable.
But I think two things have changed, and I thought about this over the weekend, actually. I was talking to Trevor Phillips about it, is the victory was quite shallow, so there's a lot of Labour MPs with very small majorities. And the second thing is, politics has been a bit like drugs recently. Have we all become, even Labour MPs, addicted to the drama, the news cycle? Politics moves much more quickly.
I think that's true, but look, it was a thin majority, but it's even thinner now. They're down to about 20% in the polls on average now, Labour. They've lost a third of their vote since the general election, and as you say, it was on a very thin mandate then, really. 33% is not much to win an election with, let alone with a landslide. Now they're on 20. If they carry on at that rate of decline, they'll be in single figures within a year. This is a very, very strong decline. The Tories are similar. They got, 24% of the election? Now they're polling around 16, 17. It's collapsed.
What do you think about this sense of the politics just moves at a faster pace?
I think it does, but what it feels to me is that we have a very technocratic government, and candidly, we had a fairly technocratic government at the end of the Tory period in power. And there are big changes and ructions in our society, in our economy, which, if you like, conventional politics is struggling to control. Brexit was a manifestation of that. Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was arguably a manifestation of that. What we're seeing now with reform is arguably a manifestation of that. And the common theme is, if politicians don't do what people want, and in particular, from a centre-right point of view, that is securing the border and fixing our broken human rights system, you will see people voting for change, and that change will become progressively more radical until you deliver.
OK, Andrew Salmon, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Talking about that change, the desire for it, we're going to be talking about, reform. Danny Cougar defecting to the party, first sitting Conservative MP to do so. He's declaring the Conservative Party is over. That's up next. Now, another week and another Conservative fades from blue to turquoise. Danny Kruger is the latest Tory to defect to the ranks of Reform. The evangelical Christian and son of the great British Bake Off star Prue Leith said he'd reached a tragic conclusion that the Conservative Party is over. What we heard from a little earlier. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, insisting that she would not be distracted by the noises off.
Danny has made his case very clear that this is not about me. I can't be distracted by that, and I'm not going to get blown off course by these sorts of incidents. I know that this is the sort of thing that is going to happen while a party is changing. I am making sure that people understand what Conservative values are. It means living within our means. It means making sure that we are growing our economy. It means not wasting money on things like net zero, which are bankrupting the country, and not wasting money on welfare to the people who shouldn't get it at the same time as we're not able to give it to those who need to get it. That's what we're very focused on now. And what I need to do is make sure that the public understands what today's Conservative Party is about, not yesterday's Conservative Party.
Kemi Badenoch speaking from another farm, as she's increasingly doing to broadcasters these days. Rob Powell is in the studio with us, though. Rob, and talk us through how significant this is, because unlike other defections, he's a sitting MP, a sitting Conservative MP.
Yeah, and I think someone who in Conservative circles would see as Tory to his boots, basically. He was someone that was a speechwriter for David Cameron, worked at Conservative think tanks, a policy advisor at Tory HQ, served the Conservative government, was in the shadow cabinet as well. Was on the shadow front bench anyway at the time of this defection. He's also someone whose seat, East Wiltshire, is not necessarily under threat from Reform. Reform finished fourth there last year, behind Labour and the Lib Dems. And more than that, he's someone that is quite a deep thinker about conservatism in a sort of philosophical sense. So I think you get a sense that he would have thought a lot about this before doing it. And that's maybe why it's worrying for the Conservatives, because do other Tory MPs of a sort of traditionalist tilt like Danny Kruger is see this and think, gosh, if Danny Kruger's thought about this and has come to the conclusion that the Tory party is no longer the best vessel for conservatism, then maybe he's right.
He's certainly not, I would say the most obvious defection that was likely to come. But it does also pose really a question for Reform too, doesn't it? Which is, they're trying to not make the Reform Party like the Conservative Party. So at what point do they stop, or they say, we don't want any more Conservatives defecting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at Reform Conference the weekend before last and asked Nigel Farage, after Nadine Dorries had defected, whether Reform was becoming a home for failed Tories now. And he sort of laughed that off. But there's kind of something in that, right? You've got Lee Anderson in there now, Andrea Jenkins in there as well. And as you say, if you're trying to run this pitch as tear up what has come before, where's something completely different, you have to be careful if you start to look too much like what has come before. Also, the Labour campaign tactic, as we've seen today and will be waged again in the future, it plays into the Labour campaign tactic of, they're all just failed Tories. They'll do what they did again before. Granted, it's more difficult to make that argument when you're making a bit of a pig's ear of the of government at the time. Talking to people at Reform Conference, though, they seem fairly relaxed about it, but just thought that maybe they need to make sure they're picky about who they're letting.
Picky, there we go. Well, we've got the best of the pick in the studio. See that transition there?
Said nobody ever.
Oh, stop it. Stop it, Simon. Actually, first of all, you know Danny. What do you think?
Well, I count Danny as a friend, and I'm really sorry about today's announcement, and I've said as much to him. I would agree with everything that Rob said. He's thoughtful, he's decent, he is a Conservative through and through. And, I'm just really sad he's come to that conclusion. It's one which I obviously disagree with. I fundamentally think that Reform are not a Conservative party. They are right-wing on some issues, in particular, obviously, around immigration, but they are not what I would call a small-state, enterprise-driven party in the way that I want the Conservative Party to be. If anything, they're quite a big state, in some ways quite old Labour prescription on lots of issues, from nationalising industry through to increasing welfare spending. And I think Danny is going to find that a really difficult philosophical journey to be part of. I think, he's been notionally employed to make them ready for government. I think trying to reconcile some of their internal tensions will be very hard, right? They agree on one big thing, but governing or even getting into primary opposition
I mean,
status
you could say, but
is about having a message on everything.
But isn't this the problem with all three major parties at the moment? Is that they can't quite agree on what they're trying to achieve?
And that is what obviously Kemi's challenge is, right? It's to rebuild philosophical coherence to the Conservative Party. We need to have an authentically Conservative message on the economy, on the health service, on housing, on defence, in a way which we lost and we need to rebuild. No one is sitting here today, certainly not me, saying, you know, everything's rosy and we're ready to go. We're not at that stage. But I don't think Danny, jumping to a group of people who are fundamentally very different to him, will advance the causes that he cares about in the way that he hopes.
Andrew, talk to me about defection, though, because actually, no matter what political persuasion you are, it's quite a, particularly if you're from the two main parties, you know, many people grow up inside those parties. It's quite a big deal, isn't it?
That's a huge deal. And, you know, I get people ask me, are you still in the Labour Party? I've been a Labour Party member since 1996, and it's fair to say I'm not the most enthusiastic Labour Party supporter at the moment, but you know, it is that connection that you've had for a long time, and it's difficult. I mean, look, I think there's an integrity question here as well. He was elected as a Conservative. If he wants to change party, I think he actually should stand a by-election. I think that across the board, if people defect, but it's different if people are expelled for various reasons that are sometimes more or less legitimate. Let's face it, from parties. That's different. But if you choose to change your allegiance, you know, I mean, you know, you were saying that he finished fourth, I think, reform
East Wiltshire
in East Wiltshire.
Is not
There's
a
no mandate for
reform-leaning
this
seat
at the moment. So what legitimacy has he got? And that's a question I think ought to be asked as well. But clearly there is this shift in politics where more of the right, in the public and in the Conservative circles, as we've seen from all the defections, are moving from the Conservatives to reform.
They want to back a winner. Simon, just briefly on this, though, is this just a further sign the Conservative Party have effectively become irrelevant?
No.
I mean, they weren't round much over the summer, and they're not really being talked about much this autumn.
I actually disagree with that. I think that there are criticisms you could level at the spring and actually the adjustment we made to opposition. But I think in the last few weeks we've actually been pretty damn good. So, the Rayner resignation, the Mandelson attack, this is the government being held to account by the Conservatives, including tomorrow's debate.
Is anyone paying attention, though?
That is a challenge, right? We are obviously, at the moment, not flavour of the month because we got thrown out of government, 14 months ago in an historic defeat. We've got a massive, massive rebuilding job to do. I wish Danny was part of that, rather than, as I say, bedfellows with a group of people who we won't agree with.
OK, well, that defection to reform is going to be one of the stories for sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. They'll be joined by the broadcaster and commentator Alex Andreou and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. OK, you're watching Politics Up here on Sky News. Up next, Keir Starmer is rolling out that red carpet, trying to walk that very diplomatic tightrope with President Trump. We'll be looking at all the potential pitfalls and potentially, I think, good things that may well come from this forthcoming state visit.
Okay, tonight from 8 o'clock, we'll hear from the mothers of the Southport attack victims as they demand accountability and change at the public inquiry. Plus, as the world of boxing remembers Ricky the Hitman Hatton, I'll speak to his first promoter, Frank Warren, and fellow boxer and friend, Amir Khan. And as adolescence cleans up at the Emmys, we'll hear from its young star Owen Cooper's drama teachers. All that much more to come on the UK Tonight at 8.
Some very familiar faces. Go ahead.
Mr. President, what can our Prime Minister say to you?
Sky News.
That's him. That's him.
He called you Daddy.
In the back.
We are.
Ready.
And
waiting for you, President Trump.
Next question.
So can I ask you, sir?
Don't miss a moment of President Trump's historic second state visit to the UK as we bring you live and continuous coverage.
Did you find it exciting?
Get the full story first on Sky News.
A lifeline for millions of people living on both sides of one of the most volatile international borders.
It's dams like these that have become inflection points between the two nuclear-armed neighbors, which could potentially lead to water wars in the future. A terror attack has shattered the peace and tranquility of Kashmir. At least 26 people have been killed and as many injured when militants fired upon them. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
The old and young, all weary after being trapped for days, as the worst floods have hit Kerala in a century.
3 days we are on a rooftop. They have no food, nothing.
The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. There have been reported deaths and many injuries, several critical.
Many families will grapple with the unimaginable loss of one of the worst disasters in India's aviation history.
The spiraling violence between two nuclear-armed neighbors that harbor decades of hostility just seems to be getting worse by the day.
Garbage dumps like this not only threaten the lives of millions of people, but also pose a deadly consequence on the environment and climate.
It is a source of death, decay, disease and pollution for hundreds of thousands of people living in its shadows.
There is so much disease because of this garbage. Sometimes it's so difficult to just breathe.
Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Over the next 45 days, an estimated 400 million Hindu pilgrims are expected to converge here in Prayagraj on the banks of the holy river Ganga and Yamuna. It's a real kaleidoscope of people from all walks of life.
Welcome back. Now, so Keir Starmer has had a pretty rough couple of weeks, losing his Deputy Prime Minister and his ambassador to Washington in pretty quick succession. So he could really do with a win, couldn't he? Who could provide that? It could actually be Donald Trump. Rather strangely, the US president is arriving tomorrow for a state visit. The flags are out, the tats is in the shop windows, as well, of course, as that state banquet, a carriage ride and a fly past. And the visit will include pretty major announcements on technology and civil nuclear energy. And the Prime Minister hopes maybe some movement on steel tariffs too. Security, unsurprisingly, will be tight. Police are reportedly preparing for high-threat incidents, although the fact that President Trump is not spending any significant time in the actual capital, in London, during his two-day trip means he'll be able to avoid the protests being staged in the capital. Andrew and Simon are still with me. I kind of chuckled there, was making the point of the fact that this might be a win for the Prime Minister, but it actually might be, given what we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, look, if this steals the show, it's petty theft, isn't it, really? I mean, he's had a terrible week, and, you know, if he does get some movement on steel tariffs, especially since they've just kind of semi-nationalised the steel industry, that will be a very good thing for the government. But there's also going to be a lot of questions from journalists, you'd hope, about Jeffrey Epstein. You know, we've just had our US ambassador leave over his connections to Jeffrey Epstein. We know the US president kept in contact with Jeffrey Epstein after his first conviction as well. Those questions have got to come up, and the contradiction between that is a very difficult thing to handle at those press conferences. Will we see those big kind of open, long-winded press conferences that we've seen inside the White House? And Donald Trump gets tetchy. You know, he's not...
and he takes lots of questions, so these press conferences tend to go on for a while.
I'm not sure he'd want to from the British press.
Simon, but the thing is, you know, a lot of people spend the last couple of weeks criticising Keir Starmer about his judgment and what he's got wrong, but actually the relationship with Trump, he's largely got right.
Well, I think he's been extremely good, actually, on handling the Americans, because it isn't easy. And actually, we do obviously need them in a variety of capacities, and we want to make sure that where we can secure good outcomes for the UK, that we do. But I agree with Andrew. I think this visit is politically almost impossibly badly timed, right? I mean, we've literally lost the ambassador to the United States in a massive paedophile-related scandal last week, and the president has awkward questions himself. I mean, that plus all the ongoing agony around free speech in the UK, which is, you know, something the president obviously cares deeply about.
Not the prescription of Palestine action, of course. You know,
well,
old pensioners holding up signs, getting arrested in their
there are lots of questions which it's going to be interesting to see how they're handled. It's just as well we have such a politically adroit Prime Minister in place.
Well, indeed. But we will have lots of pomp and ceremony too, which, to be fair, we've got a lot of criticism of Britain recently, but it still does that very well indeed. Andrew, Simon, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here. And we'll, of course, have full coverage on Sky News of that state visit with extensive coverage over the rest of this week. Do not miss that. But that's it for tonight. We're back, of course, at 7 tomorrow. Do join us then if you can. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee, including more on that very tragic death of Ricky Hatton over the weekend, speaking to Amir Khan. Do stay tuned for that. Goodbye.